Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today, we're going to get into the life of a man whose story is just, well, it's one for the ages. We're talking about David Brainerd, a figure whose short, incredibly difficult life ended up having this massive spiritual impact.
Yeah, the whole story of David Brainerd is really built on this huge contrast. I mean, look at this. On one side, you have the man himself. Gets kicked out of Yale, dies from tuberculosis when he's only 29, and is just hounded by this awful depression. But then you look at the other side, his influence. He inspired missionaries for centuries, and, get this, his life directly led to the founding of 2 Ivy League schools. So the big question is, how do these 2 completely different realities even fit together?
To even begin to understand his legacy, you really have to start with his suffering. I mean, you just have to. Brainerd's life was completely defined by hardship, both the physical kind and the mental kind.
He died from tuberculosis at just 29 years old. And this wasn't something that came on suddenly at the end. It was this long, drawn-out battle that actually started when he was just a student at Yale. So you have to imagine this disease was his constant companion through his entire ministry. And if the physical sickness wasn't enough, he was also fighting a deep and constant depression. He called it the blackest dejection. This quote from his diary, wow, it just shows you how low his spirits could get. This wasn't just a bad mood. It was a soul-deep agony that made him actually wish he were dead.
And these weren't separate problems that he dealt with one at a time. They all overlapped and just piled on top of each other. So he's physically sick, coughing up blood. He's mentally tormented by this melancholy, and his mission work meant he was almost always completely alone. Then you throw in the day-to-day misery, sleeping on straw, eating moldy bread. You're looking at a man who is living right on the very edge of his endurance every single day.
On top of all that, Brainerd went through what must have felt like a complete and total disaster. This all happened during the Great Awakening, which was a time of huge spiritual revival. But it also created a lot of tension at places like Yale between these fired-up students and the more old-school faculty. While Brainerd was overheard making this comment about one of his tutors, and just like that, he was expelled in his 3rd year. And getting expelled wasn't a minor thing. There was a new law in Connecticut that said you had to have a degree from Yale, Harvard, or a European school to be an ordained minister. So that one event, that one careless comment, slammed the door shut on the life he had always planned for. It really looked like a total dead end, and it's what pushed him onto the much, much harder path of being a missionary.
So with this background of suffering and what looks like total failure, how in the world did Brainerd respond? Well, he didn't just give up. He met all that affliction with this incredibly intense, disciplined pursuit of God. His whole response was built around these 3 key things. First, prayer. For him, this wasn't just a quick thing he did in the morning. He would sometimes spend entire days just in prayer. Second, he fasted a lot, setting aside whole days to seek God's help. And third, he was a serious scholar. He would study and write about theology until he was physically wiped out, because he saw it as a spiritual act. And this wasn't just something he felt internally. Jonathan Edwards, the man in whose home Brainerd actually died, saw the effects of these disciplines up close. He wrote that Brainerd's days of fasting were pretty much always followed by some kind of spiritual comfort or a clear blessing from God. These weren't just empty habits. For Brainerd, they were his lifeline in the middle of all that pain.
This quote, right here, this really gets you to the heart of how Brainerd thought about things. He didn't see his suffering as some pointless burden. He saw it as part of his calling. The physical and emotional exhaustion from his work actually became a kind of joy for him. He wanted to be completely used up in service to God.
Okay, so we've seen the suffering, and we've seen his spiritual response. Now we can finally get to the other side of that paradox we started with, the incredible, unlikely legacy that grew out of a life that looked like a complete failure. And here's the absolute key to the whole story. Brainerd's lasting influence didn't really come from what he accomplished in his own lifetime. It came after he died. Jonathan Edwards was so moved by Brainerd's devotion that he took his private diaries, edited them, and published them. That book, The Life of David Brainerd, has never gone out of print, and it became the thing that spread his story all over the world.
I mean, the list of people who read that book and were inspired to go to the mission field is basically a who's who of missions history. You've got William Carey, the father of modern missions, Henry Martyn, who went to India and Persia, even Jim Elliot, a martyr in the 20th century. All of them looked back to Brainerd's example as one of their main motivations.
But his influence wasn't just on individuals. His life was, and this is a quote, an essential motivational component in the founding of 2 major American colleges. The whole mess around his expulsion from Yale helped convince a group of Presbyterians that they needed to start their own school, which became Princeton. And another man, Eleazar Wheelock, was so inspired by Brainerd's mission work that he founded a school that eventually became Dartmouth College.
And this just brings it all home. The single event that seemed to torpedo his own academic and ministry career, getting kicked out of Yale, was the very thing God used to help start 2 other major schools. It's a perfect picture of God's providence working right through our human failures.
So what's the big takeaway from David Brainerd's life? What does his story really show us? It's about as clear a picture as you can get of God's providence working through human weakness. Honestly, Brainerd's story is such an encouragement for any Christian who feels weak or sick or just plain discouraged. His life is a clear testimony that God's work doesn't depend on our strength or our success. He actually delights in using struggling people to get his purposes done, so that in the end, he gets all the glory. We'll leave you with this final thought from Brainerd himself. His life was just a sprint against pain, sickness, and despair. But his focus was totally singular: to press on, finish his race, and not waste a single moment. It's a heck of a challenge for all of us, to stop and think about how we're running our own race.